Welcome to All About Art. My name is Alexandra, and I'm an art historian, curator, and writer. Within this podcast, topics relating to art history, cultural policy, the art sector, as well as a large range of other art-related topics will be covered. Conducting critical discussions, having entertaining exchanges, or just enjoying some relaxing chats, All About Art is where you'll find it all. Join me in exploring and developing cultural discourse. Welcome to another episode of All About Art. In this episode, I sat down with Alex Abbott, director of Dauphin, a company that specializes in displays and mounts. I speak to Alex about what his company does, which a lot of you have certainly come into contact with, but probably not been fully aware of. Alex does the unseen work of ensuring the objects we view and love in museums, galleries, and homes are mounted with safety and care. That ancient jug you saw last week at the Museum of Natural History, that was mounted and tilted at a 40-degree angle by Alex and his team. But his main objectives are not to impress the viewer with his skills of mounting a work of art or history. His objective is that his work remains as invisible as possible, while keeping whatever it is that he's working with safe. I speak to Alex about the artworks he has worked with in the past, including Barbara Hepworth sculptures and suits of armor. I ask him about what sort of things need to be considered when consulting on how works of art or objects should be displayed, and also what it's like to be director of a company at quite a young age. He took the helm of Dauphin at just 25 years old. We talk about the psychology of displays, the unseen work of mount makers in the arts, and so much more. Thank you, Alex, for coming on the podcast. Before we dive into the episode, I want to take a minute of your time to mention that All About Art is on Patreon. We are mostly volunteer-led, but in order to cover running costs and other expenses, we make it possible for our lovely listeners to support us, ranging from £1 a month to the price of an oat latte a month, or on the higher end, the price of a Sunday brunch per month, depending on the tier you want to choose. If every person who listens to the podcast signed up for the £1 tier on our Patreon, we would be able to sustain the podcast while also having scope to produce episodes more frequently and expand our activities in demystifying the professional arts sector. So, if you want to receive early access to episodes and behind-the-scenes content, maybe you want to get some merch, or if you just love what we do and want to support us, I would be thrilled if you considered signing up. The link to the Patreon is in the show notes. And now, on to the interview. Also, thank you to our sponsors at Synergy Associates, the Art World Tech Gurus, for supporting this episode's production at their clubhouse on Pall Mall. You can find more about Synergy and their facilities in the show notes. Welcome to the podcast, Alex.
Thanks. Happy Christmas.
Can you stop that? I'm sorry, that is such good planning. I love that.
It feels weird to say it in a warm July day, but why not?
I love it. That's dedication. That's dedication to the timeline. Can you start us off by telling me about your background, how you began to work at Dauphin, and the work that you do now with the company?
Yeah, sure. Basically by a series of chances, which are always the best careers, ones that you don't plan. So I guess to make it kind of relevant to the show, I've always had an interest in arts, particularly more music. And the kind of music scene is somewhat of an arty scene. You know, you get a lot of, it's kind of going in the same circles. So I've always enjoyed art and being creative, and music was my main kind of interest and hobby when I was younger and at university. So when I graduated, I was looking for jobs that would involve a bit of creativity. So my first job was working for a theatre company, and it was a small company, and I really liked that. So it was creative. You really felt like you were part of a team. But then being kind of young and ambitious, you want to kind of work for big companies. So I had a job working for a big publisher, and that was cool. But it kind of made me realize that I liked little teams rather than being, you know, one of 200 in an office.
I get that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Having been in smaller organizations and bigger ones, there's perks to both and there's cons.
It's nice to experience that, having a big office with lots of people that you can go out drinking with on a Friday. But then at the same time, you want to get away from just being one of a cog and feel that you're getting creative satisfaction out of something. And I saw a job going at Dauphin, which was a very small company. It was originally like a husband and wife team that set it up. And when I went for the interview, I could see that everything was run well, but very old-fashioned. And the job advertised was to help with marketing and trying to grow the company. So I kind of thought, well, with a little bit of knowledge of knowing how things are done in today's world using the internet and things like that. If the company just ticked over as it does at the moment, hopefully I could bring something to the company. And it got to the point where I was basically running the company. The husband and wife team were looking to retire anyway and had been so for a number of years. Hence why the company had probably kind of stayed a bit static. They really should have sold it probably 10 years before they did.
Sorry to interrupt, but before we continue any further, for anyone listening in who doesn't know Dauphin, can you give a little bit of an explanation as to what the company is and what you do at the company?
Yeah, sure. So I was lucky then to find an investor to buy it out, and then I could run it as my own company. But what we do is we are a company of mount makers. So the best way to think of mount making is if you take a painting to a framer's, if you've got an object, you'd bring it to us. So this, of course, makes us far better than framers because you can do 1,000,001 things with an object. No, framers are great. Lots of our friends are framers. But with looking at objects, there's so many different ways to display them. They can be freestanding, they can be mounted on a wall. Your stand can be made of 101 different materials.
There's a million things you would need to figure out in order to do your job.
Exactly. And like framing, you've got to take into aspects of, conservation, how you're going to preserve an item. So it's not just displaying an item to make something look better. It's preserving an item. It's part of, it's also the way museums kind of tell stories through their exhibitions by highlighting an item or showing how it would have been used. Displaying it in this way actually then helps people visualize how an item would have been used. I mentioned to you earlier, mind control. This is how we get into that because a lot of what we design helps create how people will interact within a museum environment or a gallery environment. So by highlighting an item, giving it an ornate stand, giving it this sense of presence, you can actually, kind of organize how people will come into a space and how they'll be move around and if they're drawn to a particular item. So you can kind of control people's mind to make them move around a gallery in a certain way, drawn to certain objects. And if you've got a little object that you really want to tell a story about, but it's your usual museum little brown item that no one's going to look at, by putting it in a stand and raising it above all the other items mean that people then want to look at it. They'll then want to read the interpretive text and understand a bit more about it.
Yeah. And I would love to also talk about, like, within your work and the work that you just described, I'd love to talk about who you work with, because you just mentioned museums, but I want to know how many of your clients are museums and institutions and how many are actually private clients. How does the work you do differ between these various clients in terms of what you create for them and how you approach work?
I mean, it's pretty much 50-50. You can win one big project in one kind of side of the market and it make it seem like you're doing loads of private client work one month and the next month it could be all museums. So it's pretty much 50-50, with 50 being kind of public spaces. So these can be museums, institutions, art galleries, different fairs. And then the other 50% can be private clients. So that's direct with the collector who's just bought or acquired a piece. Or it can be for, auction houses that are wanting to sell something, or through dealers themselves, by coming to us and getting a stand, it can make a piece, more saleable. It can help become a piece of artwork.
Yeah.
And then also with artists directly. So a lot of artists work with us to incorporate plinths or bases into whatever they're making, because they've got to make something that's saleable. So if they've got a lovely, beautiful sculpture, but it's not going to be able to hang on someone's wall or freestand, then they need some way of, having a fixation so it becomes a saleable product that someone will buy and can then understand how they use, that item. Because if you're trying to sell something, like I mentioned to you before about some natural history items, they can be really beautiful pieces. But if there's something like a crystal that's broken off a rock wall, it has no flat base. So if you're trying to sell something like that, someone can't really picture where it's going to go. But if you've got it on a stand or a nice plinth, people are then going to look in that gallery and think, oh, that looks great. That would look great on my mantelpiece, or I've got the perfect spot in the sitting room for that. So it helps make something become an overall piece of art.
Yeah. What I'm hearing as you're telling me more about your job and your role, I'm hearing a lot of different skills that are required for it. We have this sort of like psychological thing, like you're thinking about how someone will walk into a room and engage with something. And it's this unseen, invisible work, which I know that we will talk about a little bit more in this episode. But then I'm also hearing that, like, if someone has a sculpture that can't really be set up freestanding on its own, you have to think a lot about the engineering behind making sure that it's not only safe, but also aesthetic, but also, like, I can imagine that you've gotten some heavy pieces. Like, how can this withstand the weight? And how are we going to think about the actual science behind making sure that something can stand?
Yeah, exactly. And in my capacity as an art consultant, sometimes we're not even required to make a stand. People are just using us for our knowledge to organize the logistics of the factors that you've just said. So, we will firstly look at an object, and the initial starting point is always not to compromise an object's safety. That's the first thing. Usually everyone says to me, I want something that's really, really secure, but I want it to be invisible. So, to be really, really secure means I need lots of contact points, lots of areas that we're going to support an item. And then that's not going to be invisible. To make that invisible then means I've got to use magic. It's always that kind of function versus form argument that you've got to have, not compromising an object's safety, but at the same time still making something that is aesthetically pleasing. And then that's got to also then fit in with the environment that it's going. So if it's a museum or a gallery and you're also trying to tell a story or show how a piece was used, we've not got to only hold it safely and make it look good, but we're trying to actually educate, again, mind control, to show how it would have been used. So there's that factor as well. And then with private clients, it might be looking at how something is going to work in a room. So you asked about the differences between the work. Like I say, the first starting point is always what's right for the object, not compromising its safety or anything. But certainly in private client, the work can be a lot more funky. In museums, we want to make things discreet and invisible. It's a lot of using perspex because of its see-through nature. So it's quite simple, basic stands, which can be the best because they disappear easily.
Well, you also mentioned that like in museums to historically sort of educate and show how something was used in the past. And so it's also like, okay, so this bottle, you can open it and it can be shown like with the cap all the way, like levitating above the actual like body of the bottle or something like that.
Exactly. Like, we've got a jug in the room next to us. So, displaying that at an angle, showing that a liquid would have poured out of it.
Right.
It then helps the viewer understand how the object was used,
Yeah.
And sometimes if it's in a museum, it might not be a perfect specimen of a jug. It might be some old clay, pieces of pottery have been put back together and you wouldn't actually know it was a jug. But by displaying it at an angle, you've already kind of showing the mind and convincing the person looking at it how it would have been used, and then they start to recognize it as an object. But then, going back to the private client work, it's then a bit more like, okay, well, this is the star piece of our room. We want it to look really wow and funky, and the invisibility aspect isn't a concern, and they want it 6 foot in the air and made of gold. So then it's like a more blingy approach,
Have you actually had that?
We've had, things where people do want that. So it's what's quite nice about the work, because people asking us these questions is what helps us evolve, So people saying we want a gold finish or we want it to look this bronze finish, then means we have to go away and think, okay, how do we make something look this way? We've got the great skills in the workshop. It's not just me, they're the ones making and doing all the engineering. By getting these interesting commissions, it helps us grow and learn new skills, which we can then offer in the future. So rather than saying no, I just say yes to everything, and then we try and figure out how to do it.
Yeah.
Afterwards, much to the annoyance of everyone in the workshop.
I think but that's actually such an interesting lesson that I've heard a lot, especially in like entrepreneurship, but also in leadership when you're kind of at the helm of an organization and you have to find solutions for problems. There's this metaphor about jumping off the cliff and building the plane on the way down.
Yeah, and that's definitely what we do. I haven't heard that before, but that's a good one. I like that one.
I've heard it a lot, as I said, in like when I'm reading books about like entrepreneurship and whatnot. It's very like used for that. But I think that it's an interesting metaphor in general when you are trying to push the envelope a little bit, when you're trying not even to push the envelope in an industry to disrupt it or whatever, but also just to push the envelope within your own business, within yourself, within your team's skill sets. I think that that's a really valuable approach to have, is kind of not be afraid to try new things out. And regarding the process, if someone comes to you with an object, do you then go ahead and put together a proposal to sort of show them how they can envision how it will be displayed? Because, what we said earlier is you do a lot of the unseen work, and it can be hard to ensure that like your work basically goes unnoticed. Like that's sometimes the goal, to be like, how can I make my work as invisible as
no one knows we're an industry that exists.
No one knows that you're an industry. You're right. Like I didn't know. I mean, I don't know why I'm like, I didn't even know. I don't know that a lot of things exist. Like I'm not like the encyclopedia. That's the word I was like.
You're not?
I'm not the encyclopedia on art jobs. I'm trying to get there, but not the encyclopedic kind of source for that. And I'm just really surprised that like I hadn't heard of this anywhere really. Even in like working in galleries, I never really understood like, oh, we can go to someone for a mount.
Yeah.
Like this is where we get our...
We're kind of a best kept secret. There's lots of interior designers, big names in London that use us as an industry secret because they can make their clients' items look really cool.
Yeah.
So it gives them an extra string to their bow because they can say, okay, you bought all these ceramics. we can come back with a really cool display and a way of showing them off. So then they kind of outsource that to us, and then we can go in and make things, look really good. But the process, as you mentioned, it can be anything, like we're lucky we've been around for a while and got a good reputation and people kind of know how we work. So sometimes it can be as simple as an existing client already kind of knows how we work, and they will just literally give me some dimensions, and we don't ever really even know what's going on it, and we never see the finished product. We're just making something to their specifications. Otherwise, it's completely holding a client's hand throughout the whole process. So we might go and visit, see the artifact, see that new position where it's going. And sometimes it's even at the early stages. They're thinking of acquiring an artifact. So they want to get our advice. And particularly in my art consultancy roles, people will come and, contact me before they even buy something, because people kind of, before you buy a house, you'd get it, surveyed. Before, you might look at buying a car and get it MOT'd. People don't really think of the logistics of buying art,
Yeah,
there can be a lot of
this 10,000 kilo sculpture.
Yeah.
Can I put it in my living room? And you're like, your floor will break.
Exactly. And it's getting them to ask them the questions that they've never thought of before. It's like, how are you ever going to move that in the future? Or
Wait, 10,000 kilos, 10 tons? No.
Correct.
10 tons.
Yeah. So that's heavy. Yeah. You didn't say something really light. How are we going to move this feather? So yeah, it's making sure they can ask the right questions, and it's like, how are you going to, if there's a fire, what happens? How do you protect it? And because you've got a duty of care with these things as well, it's helping them to kind of ask the right questions. But kind of going back to the process you said about, so it can be starting right at the beginning. And like I say, that can be before they've even bought a piece, to discuss if actually it's even possible to fix, because they might be looking at buying this 10-ton sculpture and they might want someone to come and check the walls that actually can support it. So then it can be holding their hand throughout the whole process. They might then acquire that piece. We might then relook at it again. If we can have it at our workshop, then it's always the best, because we can, make it fit, perfectly. But if not, we understand, because you don't want to be moving these, we try to move artwork as little as possible. If we do, it's usually for the greater good, like we feel the stand is going to preserve it better. So therefore the risk of moving something is the lesser of the evil. And then throughout that process, we'll make something, we'll take videos, we might take templates, we might even bring back something semi-finished to try out in the place. The client can then say, up a bit, down a bit. We can check it in the place with lighting, bring examples of finishes. So you're really then holding a hand throughout all processes, and then we're coming back and installing it at the end. So as you mentioned, there are all these different skills from, engineering and mathematics that you've got to consider at the start, design skills, comparing that against conservation, because what you might want to do might be something that's not in keeping with the piece. So someone might have a lovely ceramic they want to put on the wall, but it's just been restored, and therefore it can't actually be displayed at the orientation they want, because it's just going to snap again. So it's looking at the fixations for that. So yeah, it can be it's what keeps it interesting. No day is the same. Every challenge is different.
I kind of feel like if I were in your position and a client came and just gave me dimensions, I'd be like, oh, okay. But if someone came and was like, come to my house, come and look at this. I just bought this. Let's make a stand. And it's like, okay, this is really cool.
Yeah.
It's fun, I think.
Yeah, it really is. But then also it's a side, you're also running a business as well. So it's like, okay, how am I actually going to, we've got to make money out of these things, So it's kind of actually, okay, the price of this stand is only going to be justifiable for that value of artwork if we don't come and visit 10 times. So we need to keep something simple. If their budget is only this big, we might have a crazy idea of what we'd love to do it. We might do that proposal and they say, oh, that would look great. But actually, I only want to spend X amount instead of Y amount. So then we've got to strip that right back and then say, okay, if I make it this way, then we'll only have to come once. We can then fit it this way. So I have had projects in the past where it sounds really fun to go on site and I'd love to see where something's going. But at the end of the day, I can't just go for free. So there was a good instance once when I sent a courier to deliver something. And then he came back and he said, oh, do you know whose house I've just been to? And he told me who it was. I won't say the name, but it was a very famous wizard. And I was like, oh, that would have been really cool to have gone. And then the next day, the guy phoned me up and paid by credit card. And you could hear in his voice exactly who he was. So that was quite sweet, because usually, when you're working for these types of clients, you might not know the end client, or you'd certainly not speak with them directly, because they might even have their own personal curators and things like that for their artwork.
Yeah.
So it was quite funny that once the courier told me who it was, to then understand, hearing their voice, it was then unmistakable on the telephone. So perhaps I should have gone to that one, but it wasn't the biggest project, and it was only a simple thing we'd made that didn't involve us installing it. But I missed out on a good opportunity.
Oh my goodness. I think that it's really important that you mention having to be business-minded, because I am someone who's so bad for it. I really struggle with the fact that I love to say yes to all these things that are really fun, but then I end up kind of overdoing it and then not having energy for the things that might actually be getting the income, or not being able to balance everything well enough because I'm giving so much of myself to a certain project, but a little bit too much to the point where I don't set boundaries and think, okay, ultimately, this is a business. Ultimately, what I'm doing is work, and I need to treat it as such as well. It's not just all fun and games. And I think in the art world in particular, because we're so passionate and we do have so much fun with what we do, sometimes it's hard to like zoom out a little bit and look at that. And as I said, set those boundaries. I think that it's really healthy to hear that, even just for me. I don't know if anyone listening feels
no,
that's
but
like,
I think that's a really hard thing about being a director, because there's the fun side that I've described to my job, but that's probably, I don't know, everything that I've talked about is probably only 10% of my job. The 90% is all the other stuff that comes with being a director. You've got staff issues, organizing customers' tax returns, all the other things,
accounting.
So, there are all these kind of things that you then have to consider. So there's the really fun part of the job.
Insurance,
and then there's
getting people on the payroll, like all these things that that I wouldn't even think about.
Yeah. Right? And being a director, it's kind of a lonely position because you're the only one that really knows that. So, everyone might be having fun, going to these fun installations, doing nice things in the workshop, and they're not really aware of what you've got to do behind the scenes. And why should they? That's not part of their job remit. But then, like you say, it's then keeping track of what jobs are going through, and that someone isn't getting too carried away with making something, and that we're then not going to hit the time frame that we've set aside for that object. I mean, sometimes you do just have to take the hit. I'd rather deliver a product that's really, really good. And if we've underquoted, that's on me. I don't want to go back to a client and say, oh, it's going to cost more money, or, say anything. If we've taken on a job, then we will do it to completion. So sometimes that means thinking, actually, the center of gravity of this is way off than we thought. And now we're going to need to grip it from this other side. And now that's going to be 10 hours more work. Sometimes I'd rather take the hit from that and the customer use you again than try and turn back and say that you want more money to cover this. So it's part of kind of growing the business. It's finding like the limit of that. I think you've got to do, like you said, you've got to be passionate and positive and take on a little bit of extra, because that's how you build up and get a good name for yourself, and you build up a relationship with people. But then at the same time, it's just, I guess if you have those experiences where perhaps you've gone over budget and it hasn't gone to plan, it's making sure you then learn from them so it doesn't happen again. So like you say, I think it is a problem that any business owner has, but it's only a problem if you then don't resolve it for the next time it happens. If you can then learn from this mistake, it's not a loss. You might have not made the money that you thought, but then you've gained a great business insight or experience into how to approach something again. So I think you can even make a loss into a win. And then this is useful for the future.
Yeah, it's never actually a failure unless you don't learn.
Yeah, it would be a failure if I went back to the client and said, oh no, I've messed up. I want X amount more money to finish your stand. Then they're never going to use you again. No one's happy. Whereas I can just say, okay, I understand this object. I can see why we've gone wrong here. Let's fix that. Let's get it absolutely perfect. Client's really happy. We're used again and we've all learned.
So on that note, because you say, I've in this fictitious example of when you may have gotten something wrong, which you probably have never done.
Yeah, just using it as an example. Just trying to sound normal.
But I wanted to ask you, not in super nitty gritty, but I do want to kind of know from a practical point of view, what aspects do you need to consider when thinking about how a specific work of art or object can be displayed? You've already said in some cases how to make the stand or the display or the approach as invisible as possible.
Yeah.
Also taking into account the duty of care for the actual object to make sure that it's safe, or, taking into account a private client's wishes for how it might look.
Yeah.
But in terms of let's say you get presented with an object, what do you do first? What sort of things do you look at? That's what I'm asking is, do you look at the weight, the dimensions, what sort of things do you have to consider there?
Yeah. Firstly, it's usually where it's going. So the first question I ask anyone is if it's something that's freestanding or going on the wall, because then we can kind of work backwards from there. Then it's looking at the object and trying not to compromise. Usually there then is something that you have to compromise on, but it shouldn't be the object or the object's safety. So it might be that if the client said they want it wall mounted and it's a piece that has been restored and can't go vertically, going to have it wall mounted. But can we create that illusion then in another way? So rather than putting it on the wall, could we put it on a freestanding stand and then perhaps lean it back at 70 degrees? So it's still got a bit of the vertical, but it's actually the pressure is then taken off the bottom of it. So now we can still fill your wall space height-wise, but it's on a freestanding stand. So we've then ended up giving the client what they wanted, but through a whole different approach. But like you say, you've then got to value that up against, does that even look good? So you might present that idea and say, look, it's not safe to put this on the wall. We can put it on this easel leaning back. But then they might say, Yeah, but the object was designed to be completely vertical, and it's going to look silly at 70 degrees leaning back. It's then looking at, can we do something completely different that they haven't even thought of to make it look better? Do we not pretend that it can't go vertical and just have it at 70, or do we not try and beat around the bush and we just actually display it flat? Because you can see there's cracks in it, it can never go vertical, so therefore it doesn't look weird that it's flat, because obviously it can't support itself anyway. So there are all these kind of...
What sort of objects do you have in mind? Like a big ceramic vase or something, or like...
Yeah, I mean, it can be we get a lot of like, social history pieces that you'd see in a museum. So used pieces, or archaeological findings. So some of those can be just rusty old bits of iron that if you sneeze, bits would come off them. So you also have to consider as well, if it's in a museum or even in a private client's house, if they want to get it out again, how accessible is the mount? Not that we have any better than a private client at moving a stand, but we might know how an object is moved. So therefore, if we make a stand, is it something that they are going to be able to, the layman, be able to get an object in and out of? So we don't want to design something that's perfect and holds it really great, but every time they want to move it, they have to call us. Sometimes that might be the case, but you need to also make sure that it's actually usable in the future going forward. So it might be that these rusty lumps of Anglo-Saxon metal in the museum can be displayed really securely, but if the curator can't get it out every time, and every time it's going to scrape and bits of the item come off, then it's not a suitable stand.
God, I feel like that's so illuminating right now in how you're speaking about this. And I think that it really sheds so much light on exactly what we were talking about, this invisible, unseen work that is instrumental in ensuring that we can actually view the objects that we want to view at various museums.
Yeah. So you do all of that, and then you've then got to make all of that invisible. So, there's a few, what I've kind of said to people, they expect there to be an amazing answer at how you make things invisible. But actually the way we do it is really just to give the eye what it expects to see. So you asked me to say the 3 words before about what the job involved.
When we were recording our socials
I think
video.
We've covered, why I said mind control, and we've covered about security, obviously keeping an item conservation friendly. But making things invisible, the way we do it is actually quite obvious. If I use we're sitting on chairs at the moment as an example, we haven't walked into this room today and there's 4 vertical pieces of metal with a plastic thing on top. What's that? Your mind just thinks that's a chair. So we make use of the fact that the mind is already filtering out information, especially when you're in a museum. You don't look at the paintings and think, why are there 4, cutouts of wood around it? You just think that's a frame. So a lot of clients get hung up on wanting things to look invisible. But if you give the eye what it expects to see, you're actually kind of hiding in plain sight. So if you have got a really heavy item, like a big dinosaur bone or a really heavy sculpture, it's kind of okay if it has a big chunky plinth or a really big bit of metal to hold it upright. Although that might sound really obvious and not discreet, if it's actually holding it where the center of gravity would be, then you're kind of giving the eye what it expects to see. The eye is processing, it's looking at that thing thinking, oh, that's a dinosaur bone, that must be heavy, therefore it should need a big chunky stand. That's okay. And then you're not actually looking at it. You're aware there's going to be mounts in a museum and something that heavy would need something to hold it. Whereas
I think I'd be concerned if I showed up and this big chunky dinosaur skeleton was just floating.
Well, yeah, that's it. If you then try and be too clever, sometimes, the client does want that, particularly in private client work. But we don't want people to be looking at an object thinking, oh, how is that standing there? And being the weird person like I am at a museum that's looking at the back of a display case trying to figure out how something's attached.
Yes,
but you just want someone...
You would do that.
Yeah. But you just want someone to walk into that museum and think, oh, there's that sculpture or there's that dinosaur bone.
Exactly.
If we start being too clever and not trying to have one big rod and loads of little vertical lines, it's then loads of things that are going to draw the eye to it. Yeah. And that's the one thing we don't want. We want it to be unseen. So by hiding in plain sight, being like a chair, you just walk into that room and think, oh, that's just that. We did a project where every stand was painted a bright fluorescent yellow color, and that would sound like it would stand out. But it was for a fire service museum, and it was the same color that was used on the fire engines and in the surroundings of that room. So by being in keeping with the rooms, the stands actually disappeared. So if I said I'm painting these stands fluorescent color, you'd think, oh my God, that's going to be awful. They're going to stand out more than the object. But if it's in keeping with the scenario, you hide in plain sight. So there's no trick to my invisibility, I'm afraid. It's just hiding in plain sight.
Well, I think it's interesting because, as you said, when we were recording the social media video before this episode, I asked you to describe your job in 3 words, and you said, what was it? Invisible, mind control, and safety.
Yeah.
And as you just said, we've covered now all 3. But I feel like the mind control, it's very deeply connected to both safety in order to ensure that your clients feel like you're handling everything with your duty of care. But then I think the mind control and the invisibility are super connected, because you have just described to me that you have to strike this really impressive balance between not being super obvious with something being very visible, but also not being too invisible, because that makes it obvious again.
Yeah.
So you have to walk this sort of tightrope to ensure that you play on the psychology of, I guess, viewership in a way of like processing what we expect to see, as you just said. And you have to take all of that into consideration when you're also consulting, when you're thinking about, okay, how are we going to display this? At least for like public institutions, right? Because for a private client, you can consult on that, but then ultimately it's what they want in their space.
Yeah, but it's trying to get them to understand that will be the most discreet thing, because sometimes they think, oh no, that sounds horrible. But it's like, well, you have come to me for my advice. That's what I'm telling you. So trust me and we'll go with it and you'll like it. But sometimes if they want something different, then like you said, they're the one that's got to look at it every day. So, I often say to people when I'm doing other lectures as well, although we have these accolades and we're well received, I'm not the best person to display your object. You are. You know what you want from that object. You know the story you want to tell. I'm just the one that can give you the questions that you should be asking or help you get to where you want to be. You might get 10 mount makers in a room and we all come up with different ideas. But if they all display the items securely, then we've all done our job right. There's no right way to display something. I mean, there's lots of wrong ways because you could endanger an object or break it, but there's no one right way. So a lot of what we do are just aesthetics that, we personally think work well. So sometimes we do get to a scenario with a client and we say, this is what we suggest, but it's up to you. Often they just say, oh, what do you think is best? And it's like, well, I don't know. You're the one that's going to live with it. You've got to look at it every day. I know how to make it what you describe, but if you want it that way, then that's up to you. And they'll say, oh, yeah, but what's the best? But it's like, there
are actually 3 different best options. You decide what you find prettiest.
Yeah, exactly. Really. You're the one that's got to live with it anyway. Yeah, I don't even like the artwork, so fine. No.
But actually, because I want to ask you, what are some of the most exciting or maybe even challenging situations that you faced with a work of art or an object? And would you be able to say what that work of object is?
Yeah, so there's been some cool, well, obviously, yeah. I mean, every day you're seeing something different. It's really interesting. So there's kind of different examples from my kind of consulting work and then, from in terms of kind of mount making. So kind of my favorite objects for kind of mount making tend to be kind of pieces of social history. It's really nice if something's been a used object and it tells a story. It's always cool if something's high value because it's just interesting. You shouldn't be bothered too much by money, but it's amazing when you're told something is worth X amount of million. So it's quite interesting when you get objects like that as well. But if you can have something that kind of combines a bit of everything, so it's got some social history, it's interesting to you, it's highly valuable, then they can be some really cool objects. One of my favorite ones we ever did was we displayed some cutlery that was used in the Great Escape to dig the tunnels. So that was really cool because they were high value items anyway. It was kind of a personal interest because, everyone's seen the film and knows the history of some of these incidences. And then also they were, you could see they were used. They had swastikas on them from the concentration camp and the spoons were all bent and dented. So it was amazing to think that these pieces have actually been used and what they've gone through and what they represent. So some of those are really cool items. And then you kind of feel inspired to go, we said earlier, you get carried away and you might want to go above and beyond the expectations of what the client wants. So you can really get behind pieces. But equally, what can be interesting as well is it's something the opposite of that. So something that you're not interested in or you're not aware of, but then you meet the client and they tell you the story of an item. And then if they're passionate about something, you can get passionate about it too.
Because you're talking about some of the most exciting aspects. And I was wondering, have you ever come across anything where you've been in a situation and you're like, oh my God, how are we going to do this?
Yeah. So, really so if I do
sculpture or something.
Looking at something from, my work as an art consultant. So I've got a really big project on in the Middle East at the moment, and the client has bought lots of sculptures from all around the world. And we were appointed to the project towards the end of the project. I always say, even with museums, that mount makers should be pointed almost at the first, because then we can help say what's possible as an object. Then you can design the case, then the room around it. But usually we're at the end, and then you just got to squeeze something into a tiny bit of room left over. But on this project, they'd already bought some big sculptures and the building was already being built. But it was quickly obvious that one of the biggest sculptures wouldn't even fit within the building. It was bigger than any of the door openings. And also what you've got to consider as well when you're buying something, again, a bit like how we mentioned about having a survey of a house or an MOT of a car, you've got to consider that object isn't just going to arrive at its size, it's going to be in a packing crate. So you've got to allow for that, because you want to open that object up at the very last minute and expose it to the environment once it's in the house, not through a building site.
So you not only need to fit the object, you need to fit the crate.
Yeah,
going
and then you've got to
around the
figure,
object.
the thing lifting that crate. This sculpture was 6 tons. So if you're going to have a fork lifting that, that's going to need a weight on it or a counterbalance. And the forklift itself might weigh 2 tons. So suddenly your floor's got to take 8 tons instead of 6 tons. And if you've only got 6 tons support in the area that sculpture's going, you also need that level of support between the door and how you get it to its final destination. So it's quickly apparent that this object was never going to fit, and it would only get fit through the roof. So it then involves getting it put into the building before the building's even complete. So it's not the ideal scenario, but if it's never ever going to go in the building otherwise, it's a case of, crane in through the roof and then having to look at how we protect it and recreate while the work goes on besides it. And then some of the difficulties can be having the conversation with other people involved, because they might not be aware of, the importance of some of the artwork. And when you're working on a big project like this, I'm an art consultant. There might be a consultant for the lighting, a consultant for the types of building materials, the finishes used. I've even worked with an acoustic consultant before who's organized how sound is going to reflect around a room. So, we're having conversations with the architects and the builders, and they then turning around and say, well, can't we just get the sculpture cut in half? And it's like, that sounds practically easy, but you're talking about a piece of artwork here, something that someone's created. If you're a museum and you just turned around and say, okay, we can't have that loan of Picasso's Guernica, can you just cut it in half? It's unquestionable. So you're getting these questions, and to me and you, that might sound deluded, but you've also got to understand they're coming from the best information from their consultancy. They want their part of the job done. So it's managing people's expectations and understanding and explaining why that can't be done. It sounds obvious to you and I, but if you're on a big building project and it's now going to cost X amount more money to put the sculpture in and work around it, someone else is just thinking, can't we cut it in half and put it through a door? It's managing all of these aspects and presenting to the client what you think is best, and ultimately understanding that you're just a consultant and hopefully they'll follow your advice. But if they don't want to, they can. But it's kind of disastrous if someone thinks, can we just cut this in half? Or can you ask the artist if they can just make it in 3 pieces instead of 1? Because, it's not understanding the overall goal of the artwork or the impact that it's going to have within the building. Yeah, it's these ridiculous challenges that you think would never ever happen. But it's why for these types of projects, a consultant is invaluable, because if we were involved earlier on, we could have looked at creating a space, a piece of glazing could stay off the roof at the very end and go in, or we can talk with the artist earlier on and give the limits of how big a sculpture should be before it's done. But a lot of these things just aren't considered on a project.
I'd love to ask you a little bit more about your involvement with Barbara Hepworth sculptures.
Yeah, sure. So we did a big project a while ago, displaying lots of them. And it's something I come across quite regularly. It sounds funny when you say these things, like you see a Picasso a week, but it's just what happens in the art world. So yeah, we have had a number of them in the past. And a lot of those actually are quite easy to work with, because the artist has actually built into them. It might not be them that did them, but a lot of them come with flat bases or chunky plinths. And then we're just elevating them, adding other plinths to them and looking at how we protect them in public spaces. Whereas how
do you protect them in public spaces? Barrier.
Again, a little bit of mind control. Yeah. So, you can have barriers and things like that, but it's looking at the overall plinth size and, the design of a plinth. So perhaps if it's got a little kickboard or skirting around that juts out more than the plinth. So if we've got a sculpture that looks nice on a plinth that's size X, and to make the plinth look bigger to protect it, it might then make the sculpture look really weird if you've got a plinth that's really big. So if we want to give it a bigger footprint so people walk around it and give it more space, we can look at having like a step on the bottom, like an extra tier or like a skirt around it. So then this actually creates a kind of visual barrier. You'll look down on the ground and the eye will see that there's a corner jutting out further, and therefore you're not going to step as close to the sculpture as you should. Little tricks like that with plinths, making sure that it's not the same color as the floor so someone's not going to walk into it. Looking at how you position them in a room and you think, this sculpture is best viewed from 6 feet away. So if someone's standing in front of it and walking backwards, making sure there's no sculpture behind that they're then going to then actually walk into. Otherwise, you have to get a bit more invasive with, screens and things like that. But even then, it's always amazing what the general public do. You think they'd never do certain things. And even with all the protection in the world, people still do stupid things. So again, considering all the things we've talked about, the mind control, the invisibility, the security, it's also looking at the factor of the room. Is that a room that is going to be invigilated? Will someone be there all the time? And then can we use that? So some of the work is exciting and displaying and making a piece look better. Sometimes it's not negative work, but it's something that you're doing you'd rather not be doing. So making a screen or something around a statue so someone can't touch it. We'd all rather not have that. But if that's the lesser of the evils and something getting worn away by the public touching it, then it might be something that we have to create.
Yeah, I understand. And I have a penultimate question for you before I ask you my final question to end the episode. As a director on the younger end, I want to ask you to tell me about some of the challenges you may have had to overcome potentially earlier on in your career, because I'm kind of looking for some pieces of advice that you could give to some young leaders.
Yeah, sure. I like how you say younger end. Years ago, I was just a young director. Now I'm just on the younger end. And
well, I kind of
soon I'll just be a director.
I kind of don't even want to say like on the younger end, because I'm trying not to actually just make the image of a director being an old white.
No, exactly.
So that's why I'm like a director on the young, instead of being like a young director, because I also feel like that almost makes you, I don't want to make you seem juvenile.
I was kind of lucky that I took over an already existing kind of company. So, there's a lot of things in place. It wasn't the risk of starting my own company from scratch. But in some ways, there were bigger difficulties because you were inheriting something that already had problems and it was really hard to rechange those. Yeah, it's kind of a weird, just kind of how it evolved with me enjoying working for this company, taking more and more on, and then realizing I wanted more freedom and then getting an investor to buy the directors out. It was something that wasn't planned initially and it just kind of evolved organically, which is kind of how I like to do things. And I guess it's always been kind of innate in me. I don't know if I'm a good leader, you'd have to ask my employees, but I guess I like being in that position. I guess, being in a position of control. So
mind control.
Yeah, maybe it's all a good fit. But yeah, so it was kind of weird to take over to begin with, but it kind of felt like I needed to keep the company going. So then it was kind of learning as you go. It's kind of, we spoke before a bit about imposter syndrome and, there's a saying, fake it until you make it. So definitely for the first few years, it kind of felt really weird to be in these scenarios. I remember one time I was stood in front of the most expensive painting ever sold at auction at the time, and the client was asking me what to do with it. And I kind of felt, there's people that go to university and have degrees in this. I've just kind of walked into this random job and said yes to everything and now find myself in this position. But, it's through putting yourselves and taking risks that you then learn. I think that's a greater experience. And it's also, not just learning your craft and what your company does, but it's the skills of being a director, understanding all these other aspects that you've got to do, look after staff, understand staff relationships. I mean, no one ever tells you that if you're going to be a director, you're probably going to become therapist to, 90% of your staff and hear their innermost stories and things that are going on at home, and then have to kind of help them with all these other issues. So there are all these unseen things that directors do that unless you're a director, you can't really understand until you put in that position.
I remember speaking to Chiwaniso Caetano earlier on this year on the All About Art podcast, and she's executive director of McDowell, which is one of the oldest artist residencies in the US. And she said to me, she was like, my job is not to be liked, it's to be effective. And sometimes it's a really hard line to walk.
Yeah, it's definitely understanding that thing that you don't need your employees to like you, but you want them to respect you. So sometimes you've not got to say what they want to hear, but I'd rather they all respect me and we all get the job done, because that is my job, is to be the director and keep the company going. So I might not make decisions that they like sometimes, but if that's a decision that's going to keep the income going and mean everyone gets paid, that's the decision that you have to take. So I mentioned earlier, it can be a very kind of lonely position because no one else understands. You kind of have to talk to other directors. And it's funny, by doing this, you then meet other people who run companies and you kind of become gravitated together because you have this common understanding of what happens behind the scenes. So there are all these kind of other unseen things that you kind of take on. But kind of advice to someone else younger or kind of starting is, that I think it's kind of in the UK, there is this shift in schools that they don't really teach entrepreneurship, or certainly they didn't as much in my time. It was more teaching you to be an employee rather than an employer. You'd learn a subject, then go get a job in that subject. They don't really think about starting a business. So I think there is this kind of myth around starting a business that it's really hard, because if you look into it, you think, I've got to register with Companies House, I've got to get an accountant, I've got to get my insurance. And all these things just scream, don't do it. It seems really, really hard. But I guess my advice is, it's kind of okay to take risks and get a few of these things kind of wrong, because, obviously don't do your tax return wrong. You don't want to go to jail. If you're doing things and just trying, no one's going to tell you off for trying. They'll tell you where you've gone wrong, and you can find people to help. So if you're struggling with something, get a good accountant, and there are people that will want to help. So you kind of solve these issues as you go. You don't need to get all your ducks in line from day one. Otherwise, no one would ever start. They'd be too scared. So I was kind of lucky because I inherited the company, and then I'd had to kind of fight these battles, each one every time I came across it, rather than trying to solve everything from day one. But yeah, there is this kind of culture, I think, in the UK where it's just far easier to go work for someone than it is to start your own company. But yeah, everyone will, it's a common thing that people are happy to go to university. I mean, it might be less so these days given the cost, but people will happily throw £30,000 towards an education that would give them no guarantee of a job. Whereas to start a company and invest some money, people are far more scared of. And I don't know why there is that reason, because you're going to come out of university with 30 grand debt and there's no guarantee of a job anyway. Whereas if everyone just went and put 30 grand into a company and started that, 90% would fail. But I think that would look as an employer, I think that would look way better on a CV. I'm more drawn to someone that said, look, I started this business, it didn't work out. 9 months later, I had to go get a job again. That to me as an employer looks way more impressive on a CV than a degree does today. I mean, it depends on the person and what they've done. But I think there shouldn't be this concern around failure. It should just be praised that you even had the idea and you started it. And it's not a loss. Make that loss into a win, as I said earlier. If your company hasn't worked out, think of what you've learned and what education you've got. That might be far valuable than someone gets out of 3 years at university.
Yeah.
I've learned more from my career than I ever did at university, but yeah, that's my fault.
Well, Alex, in order to bring this episode to a close, because I am aware of time, I want to ask you one final question, and it's a fun one that I love to ask all of my guests here on All About Art. If you could pick one artist from art history, who would it be and why?
Cool. Well, I knew this question was coming from having listened to your podcast in the past, but I still couldn't think of a good answer. So I've only got a very cringy one. And obviously I've got to represent objects because that's what I'm here talking about. So I was going to say the best creator of objects, some of the best interesting pieces we get, and the thing that most artists can be inspired by, it would have to be to sit down and have dinner with Mother Nature. You look at some of these amazing natural history objects we've got. We mentioned Barbara Hepworth earlier, but if you look at these minerals called gogots, I think they're found in a part of France. And they're these amazing natural mineral deposits. I think it's where water and minerals have flown in underground tunnels and they've got trapped. And you look at these things and they look like they could be a Barbara Hepworth sculpture. They're amazing. You'd never think that nature has created it. And we get lots of things like crystals and minerals like pyrites, where it's just formed in perfect cubes. And you just think this is absolutely amazing. It looks better than, just looks like something that should be man-made. And obviously, if we look at all great art, it is inspired by nature, landscapes. And plus, I spend enough time with real artists, so it'd be a bit of a busman's holiday. So let's talk to Mother Nature for an evening. That would be nicer.
Well, Alex, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, for telling me about the work that you do, for sharing your insights. Yeah, for just taking the time today.
It's a pleasure. Happy Christmas.
And that is it for today on All About Art. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave me a rating or a review, as it helps more people discover the show. Also, feel free to share with your friends, or if you share on social media, tag me and get in touch. Thank you so much for listening.